There is a fishing technique that requires no electronics, no expensive graphite rods, and no manufactured plastic lures of any kind. A method of understanding water and weather has reliably pulled fish from the depths for 3,000 years. It is a technique that fed entire civilizations and survived centuries of changing climates, yet it has been almost entirely replaced by a modern approach that leaves anglers frustrated and empty-handed. A technique that ancient navigators and early indigenous coastal tribes used thousands of years before the first fiberglass boat hit the water, creating a system of reading the environment so accurate that it could predict a feeding frenzy days in advance. The $15 billion modern tackle industry has built its entire commercial model on the premise that catching fish requires constant purchasing, that if you aren't catching anything, you just haven't bought the right color lure, the right scent spray, or the right electronic fish finder. History disagrees. It has been disagreeing for 3,000 years. Welcome to this channel. Subscribe and hit the bell. This is where we share what the outdoor industry left behind. Let me take you back to where this all begins. The year is approximately 1000 BC. A community of indigenous fishermen is preparing for a harvest that will sustain their village through the season. They do not cast blindly. They do not rely on luck. They are operating on a complex, multi-generational understanding of the lunar calendar and its direct, undeniable influence on the food web. Every outing is timed with absolute precision. The builders of this tradition understood through generations of practical observation that fish are not random wanderers, that they are highly efficient predators whose feeding windows are dictated by the gravitational pull of the moon, the shifting of barometric pressure, and the subtle changes in water temperature. They knew that presenting a simple, locally sourced bait at the exact moment the environment signals feeding window produces more fish than tossing 100 artificial lures during a dormant period. Fishermen operating on these ancient principles have fed their families for centuries. The patterns have not shifted. Subscribe and share. Every video we publish recovers the practical knowledge that our ancestors built and modern manufacturing quietly replaced. Here is exactly why it works, and why the tackle industry's positioning of complex lures and electronics is a necessity. It's obscured one of the most important biological principles in the natural world. Traditional fishing success relies heavily on what modern science now calls solunar theory and barometric tracking. Every predatory fish operates on an energy budget. They do not expend calories chasing food unless environmental factors signal a high probability of success. The movement of the moon dictates the tides, which in turn move zooplankton and bait fish. When the bait is forced to move, the predators feed. Furthermore, fish possess a swim bladder, an internal organ highly sensitive to barometric pressure. When the pressure drops before a storm, the pressure on their swim bladder decreases, making them physically more comfortable and triggering an aggressive feeding response. A modern fisherman relies on the visual action of an expensive lure to trigger a reaction strike during dead periods. This means their success depends on tricking an inactive fish. Traditional methods depend on environmental physics, putting a simple bait in the water precisely when the entire ecosystem is biologically compelled to eat. Here is where the story gets interesting. The global fishing tackle market generates $15 billion annually. Every tackle box, every rhododendron combo, and every high-definition fish finder that a hobbyist buys is assumed by every sporting goods store to be the absolute minimum requirement to catch a fish. The assumption is commercial rather than biological. Modern synthetic lures and advanced sonar were developed in the mid-20th century. The commercial infrastructure that grew around their production created an endless cycle of consumerism. They positioned the lure as the solution, rather than the fisherman's knowledge. If the fish aren't biting, the industry tells you to buy a crankbait that dives 2 feet deeper, or a plastic worm in a slightly different shade of green. Understanding lunar phases, barometric pressure, and natural bait requires no synthetic materials. That skill cannot be manufactured, cannot be patented, and cannot generate revenue for any supply chain. A fisherman who understands natural bite windows will outfish a boat loaded with expensive electronics without purchasing any product from the supply chain. It has spent a century making them believe that catching a fish requires buying something first. The knowledge never fully disappeared. Guides and minimalist anglers still rely on it. Here's the traditional strategy that outperforms modern gear. Track the moon. Focus your efforts heavily on the days leading up to and immediately following a new moon or full moon. Watch the barometer, fish the dropping pressure when a storm front is moving in and the barometer begins to fall. Fish feed aggressively. Once the storm hits and pressure rises, they lock down. Match the hatch. Never buy bait from a different ecosystem. If you are fishing a river, turn over rocks and use the hellgrammites, or crawfish that actually live there. Read the seams. Fish do not fight the current. They sit behind rocks, logs, or drop-offs in the seam where fast water meets slow water, waiting for the current to deliver food directly to them. A simple rig fished during a major solunar feeding window, placed in a natural current seam, will secure a catch while every modern lure in the same waters gets ignored. An ancient fisherman casting a handline 3,000 years ago did not have a fluoride carbon leader or a graphite rod. He had the accumulated practical knowledge of a tradition that understood how nature breathes and moves. He was not improvising. He was applying knowledge refined across generations in a wilderness that tested every skill it could produce. The environmental triggers, he read, the pulling of the tide, the shifting of the wind, the phases of the moon, still dictate the behavior of every fish swimming today. Those natural laws are not sentimental. They're biological evidence, 3,000 years of confirmation that the rhythms of the natural world require no purchased material to understand. A tackle industry executive in the mid-1900s looked at the sporting market and understood that a fishing technique requiring only observation and locally found bait represented a market his industry could not serve. His response was to make the synthetic lure the assumed default for any fishing application. Through aggressive marketing and the systematic displacement of natural observation from outdoor education, $15 billion in annual tackle revenue depends on you reaching for your wallet to buy a new lure before you consider whether the fish are simply waiting for the tide to turn. Subscribe and share this video.